Hello and welcome to Season 7 of the Buffy and the Art of Story podcast. If you love Buffy and you love creating stories or just taking them apart to see how they work, you're in the right place. Today I'm looking at Season 7, Episode 18, Dirty Girls, where Faith arrives in Sunnydale the same time as a super powerful misogynistic preacher, and Buffy takes an army of potentials into battle for the first time. I am Lisa M. Lilly, author of supernatural thrillers and the Q.C. Davis crime novels, as well as the Writing as a Second Career books for writers. Along with a recap of Dirty Girls, today we'll talk about using humor and conflict when characters need to share information that the audience already knows, dialogue and minor conflict that foreshadows later tragic developments, how the story structure here affects the episode's pace, and themes the episode raises but doesn't fully explore. As always, there'll be no spoilers except at the end when I talk about foreshadowing. Remember, if you'd like to get more content and support the podcast, you can do that at patreon.com/Lisa M. Lilly. That's patreon.com/LISA, M as in Marie, LILLY. Okay, let's dive into the Hellmouth. Dirty Girls aired the first time on April 15, 2003. It was written by Drew Goddard and directed by Michael Gershman. It starts with opening conflict, as any good story should. A young woman runs through the woods. Two bringers chase her. She flags down a car, and the driver is wearing black with a reverend's white collar. She gets him and says, "Thank God you were there." And the preacher says, "Well, let's not give him credit for everything." He goes on to say young girls shouldn't be out in the woods, and he comments on the looks of the boys chasing her, asking if she happened to fall in with devil worshippers. When he asks where he can drop her, she says Sunnydale, and he tells her he's going there too. She starts to call him father, but he says call him Caleb. He never was nobody's daddy, and she introduces herself as Shannon. He asks her if she thinks those things were chasing her because she's a whore. And he pushes in the cigarette lighter as he speaks. So I don't even think cars have these anymore, but it was a very mechanical sort of lighter. You would push in a button when you pulled it out, and this matters for later. When you pulled it out, it was intensely hot and would light your cigarette. Caleb starts talking about Shannon being filled with filth, being dirty. He tells her he's not blaming her. She was born that way, without a soul, with that, quote, gaping maw that wants to open up and suck out a man's marrow, end quote. Shannon tries to open the door, but the handle doesn't work. He tells her those were his boys back there, and they'll come after her if she gets out. They're not with Satan, though. He was just having fun. Quote, Satan is a little man, end quote. Caleb burns her with a cigarette lighter. She screams as he yells hallelujah. He finally stops and he tells her there's a car driving behind them. It's going to the same place she's going. He wants her to deliver a message, not to the ones in the car, but to the original, one and only, accept no substitute slayer. Shannon says she will. He stabs her in the stomach, whispers in her ear, and shoves her out of the car as it's rolling. She lands in the road, and the car behind squeals to a halt. Willow gets out. She runs to Shannon. She tells Faith she's bleeding badly. They have to get her to the hospital, and Faith says, "Yep, guess I'm back in Sunnydale." And we cut to credits. So that's about 6 minutes, 19 seconds in. And I see that as the story spark. Although you could say it starts with Caleb intercepting Shannon, which is what is going to lead to her having a message for Buffy. So you could see that as the earlier spark, and this continues it with her intersecting with Faith and Willow. On return from the credits, Potentials are sleeping in the Summers house, but one is awake. She sits on Xander's bed. I'm not sure if it's the bed or if he's sleeping on the couch, but he has the blankets over him. He's reassuring her that Buffy knows what she's doing. She won't send the Potential into battle until Buffy's sure she's ready. The Potential says she's scared and is so young. How will she know she's ready for action? There's so much she's never done. And now the tone starts to shift, and she says she's never had a a real boyfriend, and she's never been with a man. She could die tomorrow. Another potential appears, and she says she's never been with a man before either. The two of them talk about being with each other and how they've never been with a man with each other before. So clearly this is Xander's fantasy, and when I first watched it, and every time on rewatch, this part strikes me as annoying and also a little bit creepy because Nicholas Brendan, who plays Xander, looks a lot older than the 21 he's supposed to be, so it makes it feel like there's a much bigger age gap between him and these two girls. But there is a lot of foreshadowing in this fantasy. It's not just here to have an excuse to show us Xander's fantasy. There is a lot that these girls have not done in their lives, and the whole episode is about Buffy sending the potentials into battle and whether they are ready for it or not, and how devastated Buffy is by the end when it is such a disaster. On the other hand, this fantasy emphasizes one of the reasons the potentials who get injured and killed don't give more emotional weight to the episode, because I still can't keep track of who's who. One of them mentions her name in this, it's Colleen, but I do not remember which is which. And by the end, I know a potential gets killed, but I could not tell you the name of that potential. I feel like that is probably purposeful and is making a point about war and soldiers, but it undercuts the power of this episode as it does with some others. Xander now starts to act a little nervous as the girls move closer to him. He worries about the others overhearing them. They tell him it's okay, the others are busy, and a nearby door swings open. And we see a whole group of potentials in cute night clothes having a giant pillow fight. So more Xander fantasy. Then all of it is interrupted by reality. Rona tells Xander Dominic has the stomach flu and the toilet's backed up. They need him to fix it. He says he'll be right out, claiming he has a leg cramp, so he doesn't have to get out from under those blankets in front of her right now. I did enjoy this part of it. It shows the writers having some fun with the fantasy versus reality and poking a little bit of fun at Xander himself. If this was supposed to give us more insight into Xander or humanize him to increase the impact of him getting so badly injured at the end of the episode, I am not sure that works all that well. It may just be that these types of fantasy moments just don't age very well. And looking at it in 2025, Xander seems a little more creepy than he probably did to me when I saw it the first time around. The scene cuts to the hospital. Faith asks Willow if she's sure the injured girl is one of them. She doesn't look too good. Shannon is unconscious in a hospital bed and all bandaged up. Willow's not sure. She says they'll know more when the girl regains consciousness, and Faith questions whether that will happen and why, when there's something killing potentials and trying to end the Slayer line, no one thought to give her a heads up. Willow stutters and apologizes. They figured that Faith was safe in prison, and Faith says, "Yeah, that's prison, safe as a kitten." And then comments that she guesses as long as they have the real Slayer, no one was worried. Willow apologizes again. Faith tells her someone came at her with a big knife. She didn't know why until now. More foreshadowing here of the danger to come, reminding the audience that the first one's to end the Slayer line, so it's a little bit of exposition as well. And it hits on a theme of the episode because we now have that reference to the real Slayer. And earlier, Caleb talked about the one and only Slayer, and that phrasing will return again. Faith tells Willow she gets by and asks what to do about the girl. Willow tried calling Buffy, but Buffy is out patrolling, so Faith volunteers to go find her. Willow nervously says she thinks they should wait in case the girl wakes up. But Faith has had enough of hospitals for her whole life, an allusion to her time in a coma. Willow's worried about Faith and Buffy alone together, and Faith says she knows I'm coming, probably been up all night hanging streamers. I love Faith's humor throughout the episode. It continues her growth from the Angel episodes. In the past, Faith had humor, but there was more bitterness and anger behind it. She's sarcastic here, but it's delivered with a little bit more lightness. We can tell she is appropriately irked that they did not think to tell her what was going on. Yet she recognizes there are good reasons Buffy is not her biggest fan, so she isn't taking it the way she would have a few years ago. And she can express those feelings through those semi-sarcastic and humorous comments and focus on getting the job done and not let that get in the way and not be steeped in that kind of bitterness that she felt in the past. The scene cuts to a blonde woman running through a graveyard. Someone punches her so hard she's knocked unconscious. A vampire in a long black coat bends over her, and we realize it's Spike. Just as Faith grabs him and throws him to the ground, they fight. This coming scene is fantastic for humor, for conflict, and for the characters communicating things that they need to communicate, because Faith and Spike don't know a lot of things about each other. Yet it doesn't slow the story, even though the audience knows all of these things. And it's a fantastic way to get around all the explanations that Faith and Spike would have to make, or Buffy would have to make to both of them, and it's really fun. Spike tells Faith, after she's punched him again, "Nice punch," and he guesses, "By the leather pants, doe eyes, holier than thou glower, she must be Faith," and he tells her there's a misunderstanding. And Faith says, "Spike, yeah, we've met before." Spike doesn't think so, but she kicks him and he asks what she's doing. He's on her side. She tells him maybe he hasn't heard she's reformed. He tells her he reformed before she did. They keep fighting. She won't listen to him. She's sure he's lying because she saw him attack that girl. Now Buffy appears, punches Faith, then apologizes, claiming she didn't realize it was her. Faith says it's all right. Luckily, Buffy still punches like she used to. And Buffy asks Spike if he's okay. And Faith says, "Are you protecting vampires? Are you the bad slayer now? Am I the good slayer now?" Buffy tells her Spike has a soul now. Faith says something like, "Oh, like Angel." Spike says, "No, I'm nothing like Angel." This exchange and a later comment by Spike are part of what prompted me to do a new Patreon bonus comparing Angel and Spike, and specifically how they see what they did, the terrible things they did, while they had no souls. So it's Angsty Angel and Soulless Spike, and if you're a patron, you can hear that on Patreon. Buffy tells Faith that Spike fights on her side now. Faith asks them what's he doing, chasing down a defenseless, and before she finishes, the woman leaps to her feet and it turns out she is a vampire. And Buffy says that's one of the bad guys. Faith responds, "You should make him wear signs." Faith fights and borrows Buffy's stake to kill the vampire, much as she did in Faith, Hope, and Trick, the first episode where she appeared. This is a really nice, subtle callback to Faith's first appearance, and this is the ideal way to do a callback. You echo something from a previous story, but you don't put a big spotlight on it and you don't have the characters tell us about it. It's just there, and it is a nice nod to longtime fans. And there is more than one of those in this episode. Now Spike says, "Angel's dull as a table lamp, and we have very different coloring." At the Summers house, Faith says it's memory lane. But Buffy tells her, actually, everything's been broken and replaced, so it's more like a whole new house. Dawn is not thrilled with the new house guest. And I have to take a moment to talk about Michelle Trachtenberg. Her death made the news after I had already recorded and uploaded the last episode, so I didn't get to say anything. Such a terrible tragedy. She was so young, and my heart just goes out to all her friends and her family. That must be such a difficult time And it's almost hard to talk about her or watch her on screen. And I really wish that she had gotten to have a full, long life. Giles, too, is a bit somber. Faith asks about a spare bed for a wanted fugitive and then comments something about maybe not so wanted. Dawn tells her there are nice hotels that welcome tried to kill your sister types. And Faith says, check it out, Brat's all woman-sized. This is so interesting because the last time Faith was in Sunnydale, Dawn did not exist, but she has clearly been implanted into Faith's memories as well. Buffy now says she has to go to the hospital. She's very cold toward Giles. And after she leaves, Spike tells Faith that all that tension wasn't all about her. Giles was part of a plan to kill Spike for Buffy's own good. And Faith says, well, that makes me feel better about me, worse about Giles, kind of shaky about you. The scene cuts to Caleb getting a glass of red wine out of a wood barrel with a tap. He talks about the story of the Last Supper, the body and blood of Christ becoming rich red wine, and how as a boy he always wondered what happened if you were at the Last Supper and ordered white. Would it be made out of Christ's lymph? And while I never had that exact thought as a kid, I had all sorts of questions go through my head when I would sit in Mass. My family was Catholic, and I used to read ahead to the different Bible sections that were in our missals. And I always had thoughts like that. I remember asking my mother, well, why does the Bible say that before giving birth to Jesus, Mary never knew man, which was a coded way to say had sex? Why does it say she never did that before giving birth to Jesus, implying that she did after, and yet the Catholic Church insists that she stayed a virgin her whole life? My mom didn't really have an answer, so kind of weird to be identifying with the villain here, but it is a technique writers can use to bring out different points of view, and in this case, we're having a villain make observations about religion that might be controversial. It is one way to explore those types of viewpoints if you are concerned and don't want your main characters to explore them, if you feel like that would make them less sympathetic, or maybe it just lines up with the character's views. You could certainly take Caleb as he's evil, and that's why he raises all these questions about religion. Or you could see it as he's evil, and yet he raises some valid points about religion, or at least some points that many other people might share. Now Caleb says he never brought his lymph comment up, but it's probably the reason he never spent too long in any one parish. He was looking for answers in all the wrong places, and he says, quote, "Then you showed me the light." The camera shifts, and we see that he is talking to the first, appearing as Buffy. She asks if he thinks she's God. He tells her he doesn't. He's beyond that. When she notes that he still wears the outfit, he says it's because black is slimming. And she asks how he likes what she's wearing. And he tells her she's just another dirty girl, and he guesses a dead one at that, since that's all the first can appear as. She tells him to look harder. What does he see? He says he sees strength and the loneliness that comes from real strength, and he realizes she has taken the form of the Slayer. He tries to touch her, but his hand goes right through. He is thrilled that all the work he's done blowing up the council, she never showed him the Slayer. She says he's earned it and he'll be meeting her soon. He agrees and says the Slayer will get the message. He's sure she'll come. Woman's first sin is curiosity. And at 17 minutes, 25 seconds, we go to a commercial. So this is well past where in most stories we'll see a clear first major plot turn. I think of it as the one-quarter twist because in most books, at least, it usually shows up around there. Sometimes it's more like a third in a TV episode. and it should come from outside the protagonist, spin the story in a new direction, and raise the stakes. I am not able to pinpoint a clear one-quarter twist or first major plot turn in this episode. If you go by timing alone, it could be, though it would still be late, when the first appears to Caleb as the Slayer, so before they start that conversation. But the challenge is that doesn't change anything at all about this story. Caleb already sent the message to Buffy. He's already expecting that she will seek him out because of it. Now he knows what the Slayer looks like, but Caleb seems pretty sharp. He probably could have figured out who Buffy was when she turned up. This whole scene does not do anything to advance the plot of this story, but it does give us background about Caleb. We know that he's the one who blew up the council, and we assume that he has been doing a lot of the first's work. So we get background on him, but it doesn't change the story. Before we go to break, thank you to everyone who rated or reviewed the podcast, told a friend about it, or shared it on social media. All of those things help other Buffy fans find Buffy and the Art of Story. Last time I mentioned that I was recording an audiobook version of The Tower, formerly known as Sears, and 2 other tales of urban horror. It is now available. Readers call it John Grisham meets Stephen King, and it includes 3 very short stories. One about a recruiting event at an amusement park that turns deadly when the attractions develop minds and purposes of their own. Another about a woman who struggles with whether to stay in a soulless job, unaware that far more than her career is at stake. And the final one where a new chairman faces not only disgruntled attorneys, but a skyscraper bent on destruction. The title story, The Tower, formerly known as Sears, was made into the short film Willis Tower by James Ackerman, and you can watch a trailer for that on YouTube. The Tower, formerly known as Sears, and 2 other tales of urban horror is available in print, ebook, and now audiobook formats. As you can tell, it does a little bit of mixing of the different parts of my life, as the settings are ones I encountered in law, but there are plenty of supernatural elements. That's lisalilly.com/the-tower. On return from the commercial, Andrew narrates some flashbacks about Faith. So there's no sound, but we see these moments as he talks. Faith fighting with Buffy, but then turning to the dark side, fighting against her. We see her so thrilled to get that knife from the mayor as a gift and then killing the mayor's deputy. We see her shooting the arrow at Angel, threatening Willow. And Andrew talks about how no one was immune from the danger Faith posed, not even the most pacifist and logical of races. And the scene cuts to a scene that we never saw in the show, Faith fighting someone in Star Trek garb who looks a lot like Mr. Spock. Amanda's voice breaks in and asks what the hell Andrew is talking about. And we see that he is in the kitchen telling the potentials about Faith. And out in the yard, we see through the window, Faith is practicing her fighting stances. Amanda tells Andrew that Faith killed a volcanologist. He says, that's silly. Who would study Vulcans? And why would Faith kill that person? And Amanda explains to him that a volcanologist is a professor who studied volcanoes. Andrew is only a little taken aback, and he tells them everything he said was true, except for that possible word misunderstanding. And these are things they need to know. They can't take Faith's history lightly. She's a killer. Never forget that. And this was a very fun way to remind the viewers of Faith's history, because if you didn't watch the Angel crossovers, the last time you saw Faith was back in season 4. So this is a good reminder. At the same time, we've now had 2 scenes in a row that don't do anything to move the plot, although both ratchet up the tension a bit, especially because presumably even Buffy doesn't know all the details of Faith's reform. At the high school, Buffy stops in to see Principal Robin Wood. She tells him he looks better. He is still beat up from the events of Lies My Parents Told Me, where he tried to kill Spike, got the worst of that fight. So when Buffy says he looks better, Robin says he doesn't, but he'll be okay unless she starts beating up on him. Buffy tells him she won't, then admits she thought about it, then says she was joking, but turns serious and tells him she meant it, that she doesn't have time for his vendetta, but she does want him on her side. Robin says that means a lot, and then he fires her. Buffy is shocked, but he explains there's nothing for her to do at the high school. Half of the people are leaving town, not many kids are there at all, and look at the big picture. Buffy slumps in his visitor chair and says the big picture with war and all the dead little girls, she doesn't want to lead them into war. It can't be the right thing, and some of them have never been tested in battle. This, not purposely on Buffy's part, but this calls back to Xander telling the girls that Buffy will not send them into battle until they're ready. But Buffy clearly is not sure that is ever going to be a good idea. Robin suggests that maybe she needs to test the girls in battle. She offers to make some flyers for an encounter group at the school instead, and he tells her again that she's fired and reminds her that the mission is what matters. This, too, is a good way to get in a little bit of exposition through minor conflict because we find out what's happening in the town and the school. Unlike previous seasons where there was an apocalypse looming and no one else really understood it, or maybe it affected behavior a little bit, there were more fights. This time, people in the town sense it. Half of them are leaving town. A lot of students are not coming to school. And this doubles down on that theme of Buffy not knowing how to lead these girls, and her calling them dead little girls is foreshadowing for later in the episode, setting us up for how bad it will be when they face Caleb. It also tells us that Chloe's death and deaths of other potentials really weigh on her. This all occurs around the midpoint of the episode. And as you know from previous episodes in my books on writing craft, here is where I look for and nearly always find in every TV show, movie, novel, either the protagonist makes a major commitment, throwing caution to the wind, going all in on the quest, suffers a major reversal, or both. And here, I am not sure I see that. Buffy doesn't make any commitment here. Robin fires her, so she has less other things to do, but she is uncertain what to do. This almost feels more like the first major plot turn because Robin, outside of Buffy, introduces that idea of maybe she should test the girls in battle, and we will see Buffy decide to do just that in a bit. This made me wonder, is this a two-part episode with the next one, Empty Places? However, as I continued watching this one and breaking it down and I looked ahead to the next, I don't quite think that is it. And maybe the answer is these last 5 episodes, 18 through 22, are all part of a continuing story arc, which is moving a bit slower than any single episode with a full story arc normally would, especially because we have this new character, Caleb, and we need background on him. And this illustrates one of the challenges of bringing in a brand new, wholly unknown character toward the end of your story. If we view all of season 7 as the full story arc, this is really late to introduce a brand new character who is so significant. It means you then are, as the writer, needing to work in all this exposition at a point where normally in the last 20% or so of a story, you should just be driving toward that climax. In this case, the finale of the entire series. And if you view this as the end of 7 seasons, then it is super late bringing in a new character. I'm not saying you should never do it, but the pacing issues here and minor foreshadowing in some later episodes show why it is such a challenge. Faith heads downstairs to the basement. The potentials are talking and joking upstairs. She sighs and sits on the steps and lights a cigarette. Spike, who she didn't notice, asks if she's craving a moment alone or can he bum a cigarette. He's sitting on that cot he has down in the basement, the sheets over him up to the waist, his chest bare. So I don't know, is Spike just sits around naked in the basement? I mean, maybe he's got sweatpants on under there, but I don't think so. Faith and Spike share a cigarette. She notices the shackles on the wall, and he tells her it's not what she thinks. She tells him no judgment. She used to hang out with a guy with a bullwhip who liked her to dress up like a schoolgirl. He interrupts to tell her he got dangerous for a while, but he got over it. Faith asks, was that before he got his soul or after? And he tells her after. But he doesn't want her to get all dust happy. Faith talks about the wannabes upstairs, and she and Spike agree that it gets to be a bit much. He asks why she's not up there imparting her wisdom, but she says that's Buffy's thing, and adds that she just got out of prison. She had her fill of being locked up with a bunch of female types. Spike comments on her waiting until Angel needed her to bust herself out when she had the power to walk away. There was nothing to stop her, and she tells him she stopped herself. She got dangerous for a while. When he asks if she's over it, she says more or less. She fights with the good guys now. And the less is she might look up that guy with the bullwhip, and she says long incarceration. As they talk, she and Spike finish each other's sentences. There is a lot of camaraderie and chemistry there. And I was thinking that in some ways they have even more in common than Angel and Faith do, because they both chose to reform where Angel was cursed with a soul. And when he became Angelus again, he did everything he could, or Angelus did everything he could to resist having that soul return. And in contrast, Faith made a choice to go to jail. She chose to stay there. She only came out to help. And Spike, without a soul, made a choice to go and get his soul. He fought for it and suffered trials for it. Faith sits on the bed next to him and tells him she met him before when she was wearing a different body, which he seemed okay with. He says he knew about the body swap, but didn't know who was driving Buffy's body around. And he remembers Faith telling him she could ride him till his knees buckled and squeeze him until he popped like warm champagne. He tells her it's not the kind of thing a man forgets. And Faith tells him he should have known it wasn't Buffy. She'd never throw down like that. Spike says, "Oh, you have been away." Faith is really surprised. Spike clarifies that nothing's been happening lately between him and Buffy. Faith says everyone's just full of surprises as Buffy comes down the stairs. And her expression makes it so clear she is not thrilled with a surprise of seeing them sitting on the bed sharing a cigarette. This is a great use of a dialogue line of Faith's about being full of surprises to transition to a entirely different tone when Buffy is the one who is surprised. And Faith now says, "Hey, B." Buffy folds her arms over her chest and says it's nice to see them getting along so well. Faith shifts away from Spike and says Buffy just knows all the cool vampires. When Spike asks, isn't Buffy usually at work around now, Buffy tells them she cut back on her hours, figured she'd be better off focusing on what's going on around there. Dawn calls down the stairs to say Willow called and the girl is awake. At the hospital, Shannon tells Buffy and Willow what happened. The message for Buffy is that Caleb has something of hers. Back at the house, Buffy tells everyone about Caleb. She thinks he might have another potential or something else. Buffy doesn't care what it is. She's tired of talking and training. He has something of hers. She's getting it back, and they are coming with her. And we cut to a commercial. That was about 27 minutes, 34 seconds, and it is a very big commitment, quite a ways past the midpoint, but this feels like that major commitment. She's throwing caution to the wind, and she's taking those untested girls into battle. It's also, whether you see it as a major plot turn or not, a great escalation of the conflict and clearly raising the stakes. On return from the commercial, a young woman in a white dress approaches Caleb in the wine cellar. She tells him she was drawn to his preaching. He says he called her to him, and that a woman has her urges and a man has his. And the young woman says, "It's not wrong to be drawn to the power, is it, preacher?" He tells her it's not. And they are deep in shadows, so we don't see what happens, but we hear her gasp. And then she falls on the floor in a pool of light. She's bleeding, and Caleb stands over her holding a bloody knife, and he tells her it's not wrong, just human. The young woman turns into Buffy and stands. And the first, as Buffy tells Caleb, most people don't like visits from their dead. Caleb wants the first to do it again, and the first says she takes requests, maybe one of the potentials, but he's more in a memory lane mood and talks about a girl he gave singing lessons to. She even screamed on key. This is another example of something I talked about earlier this season, which is the first doesn't seem all that formidable. It is basically doing impressions for Caleb, which feels really underwhelming. And while it shows us that Caleb poses a real physical danger to women and girls, we knew that from him stabbing Shannon, and it doesn't make him seem much different from a non-supernatural serial killer. Not that I'd want to hang out with one of those, not that those don't pose a great danger, but it doesn't feel like that end of the world supernatural danger, unless you really think about, okay, but he probably could kill a whole bunch of potentials. The other thing is, as with the other scene between Caleb and the first, this does nothing to move this story forward. It is filling in backstory about Caleb. The first comments on all the girls Caleb killed, how he tricked them into following him. He says he just told the truth, and following is what they do best. This is another comment that links or transitions to the next scene, or perhaps adds some dimension to it, because Buffy is telling her friends they need to start arming the girls. But it's a contrast because the friends are not following or falling in line. Willow protests they don't know where they're going or where to find Caleb. Buffy says that's why they need to do some recon and asks Faith if she's in, and Faith is. Giles questions whether Buffy's sure this is the right course. She doesn't even know what Caleb has of hers. Buffy says it could be a girl, a potential trying to get to them, and Giles says it could be a stapler. He worries about the potentials. They've never been tested in battle, and Buffy says it's time they are tested. She'll only take the ones who have been there the longest, which I have to say makes a lot of sense. Spike raises the idea that it could be a bait and switch. Willow jumps in that Caleb might lure them away, then attack the potentials left at the house. But Buffy has thought of that, and that's why Willow needs to stay there. Xander, too, is concerned that it's a trap. Buffy says Caleb won't be expecting a full attack this soon. That's why they have to move now. Giles insists they need more time. They can't go into battle unprepared. Buffy tells him they don't have more time, and he's not going into battle. She adds, I need you to stay behind with the other girls, with the girls who still need a teacher. Is Buffy's logic sound here? This is one of the things I enjoy about this episode because this is genuine conflict. Everyone is raising good points, and you can see Buffy's point. They have been playing a waiting and reacting game, not knowing what the first has planned, and it does feel a lot like waiting to be picked off one by one. And it's not as if another few days of training is going to turn these girls into slayers. They are not as powerful as Buffy and Faith, and there's no way to know how well they'll be able to fight until they fight. They've had a few incidents where they've done some fighting, and that is why it makes sense that Buffy would take the ones who've been around the longest, who have faced some danger. And Buffy isn't wrong that Caleb might not expect all of them to attack. He is expecting Buffy. But as we'll find out, it isn't a problem for him that she brings all of them, but Buffy doesn't know that. In fact, right now, Buffy doesn't have reason to think that Caleb physically is more powerful than other humans. At the same time, the points the others raise are also good ones. Just because Caleb says, I have something of yours, doesn't mean he has anything. He is trying to taunt Buffy and draw her in. This scene also does a great job of showing that both Buffy and Giles are affected by the clash between them. Giles is more harsh, Buffy is more entrenched in her position, and Giles is less open to respecting her position, so they're not able to work together to perhaps come up with a better plan. Although I do think this one's pretty good, at least to begin with. Go and do some recon with Buffy and Faith. At 31 minutes, Buffy and Faith are in the woods near the vineyard, and Faith marvels at the bringers, who are moving around with no eyes, and asks if they just roam around town. Buffy says normally they show up, stab or get stabbed, and run off. This is a nice way to call out what to me is a flaw in the storytelling, that the bringers just seem to fight as much as we want them to and then just disappear for no particular reason. Buffy adds that with all those bringers around, it's like Caleb wants to be found. And Faith says, lends weight to the whole it's a trap theory. Buffy, irritated, says she's through waiting around. And Faith says she's with Buffy, drop her in the hornet's nest. Then she comments on it being a tough situation, trying to turn the girls into an army. But she will help work with them. Some seem really eager. Some are fashion disasters. And Buffy stops walking and asks why Faith came back. Faith tells her Willow said Buffy needed her and asks if Buffy wants her gone. I have gotten some questions about what am I going to do with the podcast now that I'm almost done with all of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Initially, I was not planning to take on Angel, the series, partly because while it has some amazing episodes and arcs, I have never loved it the way I loved Buffy. I watched it when it was on regular TV, network TV, and the only time I did a full rewatch was during the pandemic. And it did not make me want to dive into the show at that time, but since then, covering more Angel episodes for the Buffy podcast, I feel like I've seen a lot more in it that is intriguing and that I'd love to explore further. Plus, it occurred to me that as a writer and storyteller, I often learn more from why a story doesn't work for me, why it doesn't speak to me, than when it's one I just out and out love. Finally, lots of people love Angel. Some prefer it to Buffy the series because it deals more in the gray areas, and I want to explore that further and see what I think of it. Right now, my thought on the format of the show is that it will be a little bit different. I'll still do a fairly detailed summary of the episode, but it will be a bit shorter. I don't plan to do the same kind of moment by moment breakdown. And then I will talk about a few different points about each episode. First, of course, because story structure matters so much to me, I'll talk about plot or not, what worked best and least. Then about theme, or what was the point of the episode. Then the most fascinating character and why. So it could be a villain, it could be a hero, it could be a character who's on for only a few minutes, but who fascinated me the most. The most out of character action or line, Now, this is from memory, but I feel like Angel had a bit more of that than Buffy did. I could be wrong, though. I'm excited to see if that impression is accurate or not. So who knows? Maybe that most out of character action or line won't be a continuing category. Probably a favorite quote or quotes from the episode. And finally, I will rate each episode from 1 to 10, with 10 being the equivalent of my favorite Buffy episodes, like This Year's Girl and Who Are You, and the musical episode, and 3.5 or so being my least favorite Buffy, like Beer Bad and Where the Wild Things Are. And again, I may be surprised, but the reason I am setting that scale is my memory is that my least favorite Angel episodes would fall a ways below on a scale compared to my least favorite Buffy episodes, which when I revisit, I always find amazing things in. But we'll see if that happens. Maybe I'll have to adjust the scale. But for now, that is the plan. So I hope you will stick with me when I shift to Angel. If you've watched this series before, you could see if you agree or disagree with my take on it. If you have not watched it, or you have not watched it all the way through or done a rewatch, this could be a great time to do it. Or you could do what I know some listeners do with Buffy who aren't quite the diehard fan that I am, which is to just listen to the podcast and skip watching altogether. I will continue to tell you enough about it that you don't have to have recently watched the episode to get a lot out of it. Please let me know your thoughts. Are there topics you think I should include when discussing Angel? And what do you think of the format overall? Buffy backs off. She admits she's glad Faith is there and thanks her. And Faith says, "No problem, all about the good deeds." Her continuing humor is a great antidote in this episode to what is otherwise pretty dark. We're hearing a lot of dark things about Caleb. Buffy's very frustrated. There's a lot of tension between her and her friends, and especially with Giles. So it's wonderful to have Faith there speaking the truth as she always does and adding some humor to it. And it's interesting because Faith really is more on Buffy's side here. She is always action-oriented. She's the last one to say, oh, we should just hang back and wait for something to happen. And it's nice to see Buffy make a little bit of effort to put aside their differences and recognize that, or at least start to recognize that Faith is an ally here. They talk about Angel. Buffy's not super thrilled when Faith passes on the Angel says hi message, but she asks how he is, and Faith says he's better now, and she had to do this whole magical mind meld thing with him. And Buffy says, "You were in Angel's mind?" But they don't get to talk about this because they've reached the vineyard. This exchange highlights that Faith really knows Angel better as he is now than Buffy does. Buffy has not spent much time with Angel in the last few years, and now Faith has been in his head. And Buffy just saw Faith with Spike. So that cannot be great for her, but she does put it aside because they've reached a building. I'll call it the wine cellar. I guess that's what it is. Given those wine barrels down there. There are more and more bringers around. Faith says she thinks they found the hornet's nest, and Buffy says it's time to get the cavalry. This is right around 3/4 through the episode, where usually we see the last major plot turn that comes out of the midpoint and takes the story in a new direction, sometimes raises the stakes. I'm not sure this is a new direction because this was the plan to take the potentials into battle to face off with Caleb, but this does allow that part of the plan to go forward. First, they had to find Caleb. It doesn't really raise the stakes. Now the plan is going forward, but it's the same stakes as when Buffy committed to the plan. At the house, Xander is telling the potentials to go for killing blows only. Chest or throat if it's a vampire, stomach, chest, and face if it's a bringer. If it's something otherworldly, don't go for the flashy tentacles because they're waving all around. Go for the center, the brain, the heart, the eyes. Everything has eyes. And Dawn says, except the bringers. And Xander echoes, except the bringers. More foreshadowing here because Caleb will literally poke Xander's eye out of its socket. Some of the potentials are nervous, but Kennedy is eager, and this is when I like Kennedy. She is excited to fight. Amanda and Andrew start to argue about how Matthew Broderick killed Godzilla in the movie, and Xander joins in, and Rona interrupts and says, "You people are even crazier than her." She is talking about Buffy, saying Buffy is crazy to take them right into the bad guys' lair. Xander points out that that's generally where the bad guys are, and she came here to fight bad guys. But Rona counters that she came for protection. And this highlights one of the other real challenges here and for Buffy, for all of them. These potentials, other than maybe Kennedy, didn't come here to fight. The first was trying to kill them. And this adds to that challenge of how does Buffy come to terms with leading these girls into battle, even if it might be the only way in the big picture to prevail or protect them. Rona says the plan is trouble and Buffy doesn't care who gets hurt. Xander now gives a speech. He says he'll tell them about Buffy. And he says, "I've been through more battles with Buffy than you all can ever imagine. She's stopped everything that's ever come up against her. She's laid down her life, literally, to protect the people around her. This girl has died 2 times and she's still standing. You're scared? That's smart. You've got questions? You should. But you doubt her motives. You think Buffy's all about the kill. Then you take the little bus to battle. I've seen her heart, and this time not literally. And I'm telling you right now, she cares more about your lives than you will ever know. You gotta trust her. She's earned it." Faith and Buffy walk in during the speech, and Faith turns to Buffy and says, "Damn, I never knew you were that cool." Buffy responds, "Well, you always were a little slow on the uptake." This is a great speech. It doesn't quite work, and I think it is supposed to not quite work, because the challenge is, yes, Buffy has earned that with her friends, but not with the potentials. They have not seen this, and there is a huge difference between someone telling you Buffy laid down her life for her friends and for the world, and being there and seeing it, and having Buffy do that for you. Plus, Xander, Willow, Giles, they knew Buffy when she was season 1 and season 2 Buffy, when she was so much more open with her feelings and her heart, when she connected so much more with her friends and turned to them. And she has gradually been through so much, has withdrawn more, so that the potentials are never going to feel that kind of connection with Buffy. Even if there were only 2 or 3 of them, they would not have that closeness with Buffy. Even if Buffy tried, there wouldn't be that personal connection that shores up the type of faith and trust that Xander has. The scene cuts to the vineyard outside the wine cellar. Buffy tells everyone what to do. Faith and Xander will stay outside to be ready with some reinforcements. Xander asks, "What's the signal for coming in?" And Buffy is thinking lots and lots of yelling. Another subtle callback, this time to Doppelgangland, where Willow, impersonating Vampire Willow, goes in by herself and says the signal will be screaming. Buffy goes in with Spike and some of the potentials. The bringers come out and start fighting, and the potentials join in using their swords. Some of them do pretty well, but suddenly the bringers back off and Caleb emerges. He taunts the girls. Buffy tells him to save the sermon. She heard he has something of hers, and Caleb says, "Well, I do now," playing off all the concerns the others raised that this was just a way to lure Buffy there. And now we are into the climax, where the opposing forces have their final clash and resolve the conflict. Caleb comments on Buffy being the slayer, the strongest, the fastest, the one and only, the representative of the notion of goodness. So this is the 3rd time that we have heard this about Buffy, the one and only, the real Slayer. And that is a 3-beat where you echo the same dialogue line or perhaps the same theme or the same action, but the third time should subvert the others. And here that does happen because he goes on, the Slayer must indeed be powerful. And then he slugs her. She flies across the room, hits a giant wine barrel, and falls on the ground unconscious. Caleb says, "So, what else you got?" This is a truly scary moment, especially for the potentials who have been counting on Buffy. Spike vamps out. He fights Caleb, who is basically playing with him, and then throws him into a wine barrel, which breaks open and red wine flows over everything. The potentials attack. He breaks Rona's arm. Xander and Faith enter. Xander shoots a bringer with a crossbow because they've been out fighting too. Faith fights Caleb, who comments on her being the other one, quote, "the Cain to her Abel," end quote. She gets some punches in and says, "never was one for the good book." He kicks her aside really easily, and this is the first time in all my watches that I noticed that he dispatches Faith almost as easily as Buffy. And you get the feeling the only reason he doesn't do it with one blow with Faith is he didn't feel like it. He wanted to spar with her first. And before, I always thought he just knocked out only Buffy with the one punch and that Faith did much better. Caleb says he likes to keep things simple as he continues injuring and killing potentials. Good folk, bad folk, clean folk, dirty folk. Buffy wakes up. She tells Xander they have to retreat. He starts rounding up the ones who are still alive. Caleb says he works in mysterious ways, also some fairly straightforward ones, as he knifes another potential. Buffy attacks, and this time she does do better, which is something else I did not notice on earlier watches. She is doing a good job dodging his blows, and she manages to kick him across the floor. But Spike grabs her arm and says they're leaving, and as she and Spike move the potentials out, Caleb grabs Xander, and he says, "You're the one who sees everything, aren't you? Let's see what we can't do about that." This is a callback to Dawn telling Xander maybe that's his power. He sees what others miss because he isn't supernaturally powerful. Caleb grinds his thumb into Xander's eye, right into the socket. Xander screams. This might be the most visceral injury we have seen. And we've seen stabbings, we've seen stakings, we've seen beheadings, but there's something about this. And I don't think it's just because I have that eye phobia myself. Buffy runs to Xander. She and Spike help him out, and Caleb smiles as they leave. So this major conflict between Buffy and Caleb ends with Caleb prevailing. And we're now in the falling action part of the episode where the writers tie up loose ends, resolve subplots, and in a series, sow in seeds for future episodes. The scene cuts to a nighttime aerial shot of Sunnydale, and Caleb in voiceover says it's a simple story and nothing is so bad that can't be made better with a story. As he talks, we see Buffy looking at the girls in the hospital, badly battered and bandaged. Caleb goes on about there once being a woman, but she was foul, made from Adam's rib, and he was foul too because he was only human. The woman was filled with darkness and despair, and we see Buffy walking alone at night in the streets of Sunnydale. Caleb goes on that the woman didn't know the good news, didn't know the glory coming, quote, "that would be you," end quote. And the camera shifts, and now we see he's talking to the first as Buffy in the wine cellar, and she smiles at him, and he finishes, "For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours now and forever." And this is from a Christian prayer, the Our Father. He tells her if she shows up, they'll get in line because they followed her. And we cut to Buffy again. And all they have to do is take one more step and he'll kill them all. Quote, "See, I told you it had a happy ending," end quote. So we end with that seed for the future, that hook, that somehow having followed Buffy that far, they'll take one more step and he'll wipe them all out. So a couple other themes that are in this episode are, in addition to that danger of being a follower, the danger of being drawn to power. It leads to the death of some of the girls in Caleb's past, perhaps the dangers of religion. Although you could read it the opposite, that Caleb makes a mockery of religion, and that is why he poses such a danger, or that goes with him being a villain. And there are many unanswered questions to keep us hanging in there. For instance, we still don't know what exactly is Caleb's plan or the First's plan, and how do these go together. As a whole, I have never loved this episode, partly because probably of those pacing issues, and because I just have never really loved Caleb as this villain coming in at the end. I don't know what else you would do. We have this incorporeal force, and you need to have some way for it to affect the physical world. So Caleb seems to be that, and we'll see if that works better for me as his part is more developed, because this time we did have a lot of backstory and exposition about Caleb, which slowed the pace. At the same time, I do love Buffy's emotional journey here and her struggles with how to lead this army of potentials. And this is really starting the culmination of all the concerns she has had since the potentials came to town. So more of that next time. If you are not sticking around for foreshadowing, which does include spoilers, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you will come back next time for Empty Places, where Faith takes the potentials on a night out and has a run-in with police, and everyone pushes back against Buffy's plan to attack Caleb again. And we are back for foreshadowing, which does include spoilers. The tension between Buffy and Faith escalates in the next episode. They have a confrontation after Faith takes the girls out at the Bronze and the police come. And it's because Buffy is so worried about the potentials, but no doubt these feelings about seeing Faith with Spike, knowing Faith was in Angel's brain, don't help Buffy's feelings. I'll see what I think when I rewatch, but my recollection is that Faith handles it pretty well. And of everyone, Faith was the most consistent character-wise and the most believable when everything falls apart next episode and Buffy ends up more or less being thrown out of her own house. Rona saying Buffy is crazy in this episode and Giles and the others pushing back foreshadow that confrontation in Empty Places, where all of them decide they are better off with Faith leading. The one more step that Caleb talks about seems to be alluding to the plan that is not going to come to fruition in Empty Places, but I believe in the following episode, where Faith is in charge and they go to the school thinking that Caleb has something there, that's where they should attack him, and instead they find a bomb that explodes and kills more potentials. So it seems that they are following Buffy, and he is thinking he's going to lead Buffy to that place and she will lead the potentials and he'll kill everyone at once. And instead it ends up being Faith who leads them there. But to an extent that plan is successful and Caleb was not wrong about that. But because Buffy has gone off on her own, not really by choice, but she is there to fight Caleb when everyone else is at the school. Ironically, that explosion for those who are left makes them see, maybe not just the explosion, but Buffy returns and helps get them out of it. And it helps them see that there isn't one right path. There isn't going to be a leader who's going to do everything right. Buffy is very clear that it could have been her who led them to that explosion, just as she took them into Caleb's wine cellar the first time and people got killed. In a way, it brings those who are left together, or helps bring them together. Let's see if I still think that when I watch the episodes again. Xander's speech about Buffy in this episode is such a contrast to what he says when he comes back from the hospital and tells Buffy he just can't see it her way when she wants to go back in after Caleb. And I think that it is meant to be a contrast. I'll talk about it then when I rewatched last time, which would be probably a couple years ago. It felt off to me like, oh, Xander was all in for Buffy and all these things are still true that he said, but now that he is badly injured, he's kind of taking it all back. After talking with Tiffany Nieheiser about grief in the Buffyverse, I suspect I will see that episode differently, and I am going to go back and re-listen to my conversation with her, and I'll put a link in the show notes for this episode or the next one in case you would like to do that as well, because it really helped me see that it was likely less about, oh, Xander got badly injured and now suddenly he sees it differently, and more about the different ways that people process grief and the others needing something more from Buffy, or at least needing Buffy to give them more space to grieve, where Buffy is grieving by racing into the next part of her plan or a different plan. So I'm really excited to look at that again from that perspective and look at everyone's reactions that way. Buffy dodging Caleb when she faces him the second time in the wine cellar foreshadows how she will deal with him when she does go back to face him and she's able to get that sword away from him. She manages by darting away from him, by dodging his blows. She can't overpower him physically at that point, but she can be more nimble and quicker. The fact that she was starting to do better against him in this episode adds a little more to why Buffy thought they should go back in, because much as I was a little bit thrown by Xander's attitude in Empty Places, I was a little thrown by Buffy's as well, because she doesn't seem to have any reason why she thinks things will go differently. Now, maybe when I watch it again, I will see even more of what she has in mind, but at least this time I realized, oh, she did do a little better when she had had a chance to evaluate Caleb a little bit more. The reference to power, Caleb explicitly talking about it, continues the season theme and plays into Buffy's decision toward the end to share her power with the potentials. And this is a huge contrast to Caleb, who wants more and more power himself. He wants to merge with the first. He is seeking power over others. Buffy wants, in contrast, to empower others. So a huge thematic contrast between the two that does pay off. Finally, while watching this, something occurred to me that answered a question that has bugged me forever about season 7, which is that everyone acts like Buffy has never faced a foe that is so much more powerful than her before. Adam knocked Buffy out. Glory, physically so much more powerful than Buffy, very much like Caleb, probably more powerful than Caleb. And Xander, Willow, and Giles and Anya never mention this. Everyone acts as if this is just unprecedented. And it finally occurred to me as I was watching that probably it's because this was still network TV. And while there were DVDs eventually, for the most part, if you watched Buffy and you didn't watch it the first time it was on network TV, you saw it in syndication, which meant you might pick up an episode here or an episode there. So I have no doubt that the writers did not want to allude to Glory or Adam specifically or talk about how they had defeated more powerful foes before, because that would spoil those seasons. And if someone dropped in and was watching season 6 and 7 and hadn't watched those seasons, you would ruin it for them. And there was much more concern for that. So I'm excited to go forward with the last 4 Buffy episodes, and kind of sad as well that I'll be done with this deep dive into the Hellmouth and into Buffy. But I'm so pleased that I can share it with you. So thank you again for listening, and a special thank you to the patrons who support this show. Remember, you can get access to bonus content on Patreon for as little as a cup of coffee a month, probably less than a cup of coffee a month, depending where you live. And the latest one does compare how Angel and Spike and the other characters see the terrible things that those 2 vampires did when they didn't have souls. Please come back in 2 weeks for Empty Places, where Faith goes out on the town with the potentials and everyone resists Buffy's plan to confront Caleb again, to the point that they throw her out of her own house. You can find back Buffy in the Art of Story episodes, as well as the Buffy in the Art of Story books and all my fiction and nonfiction at lisalilly.com. For more Buffy in the Art of Story content, early releases of regular podcast episodes, and access to my course, How to Plot Your Novel from Idea to First Draft, join the Patreon community at patreon.com/LisaMLilly. Music for this episode was written and performed by Robert Newcastle. Buffy in the Art of Story is a production of Spiny Woman, LLC, copyright 2025. All rights reserved.